Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's virtual event with Brookline Booksmith, featuring Ayana Gray, Namina Forna, and Kalynn Bayron to celebrate the release of all their sequels, which we'll get to talk about in just a minute. My name is Bonnie, and I'm a bookseller at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Massachusetts. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. If this is the first time you're hearing about us, welcome. We are so happy to have all of you join our community this evening, and we really appreciate your support of these authors' incredible books and an independent bookstore through your purchases and attendance. And now for introductions. Kalynn Bayron is the author of YA novels Cinderella is Dead and This Poison Heart, as well as the forthcoming middle grade paranormal adventure, The Vanquishers. Her books are New York Times and indie bestsellers. She is a two-time Sybil's Award nominee, and she received the 2022 Randall Keenan Award for Black LGBTQ fiction. She grew up in Anchorage, Alaska, and is a classically trained vocalist. When she's not writing, you can find her listening to Ella Fitzgerald on loop, attending the theater, watching scary movies, and spending time with her kids. She currently lives in San Antonio, Texas with her family. Her latest book is This Wicked Fate, a sequel to This Poison Heart, where Kalynn continues the story of Briseis and her family's unique magic. Ayanna Gray is a New York Times bestselling young adult fantasy author and lover of all things monsters, mythos, and magic. Originally from Atlanta, Georgia, she now lives in Little Rock, Arkansas, where she reads avidly, follows Formula One racing, and worries over the varying moods of her adopted baby black rhino, Apollo, and her mini golden doodle, Dolly. Her New York Times bestselling debut, Beasts of Prey, is being adapted for feature film and is currently either translated or being translated into 10 different languages. Very exciting. In Beasts of Ruin, the much anticipated sequel of Beasts of Prey, Kofi's powers grow stronger and Ekon's secrets turn darker as they face the god of death. And finally, Namina Forna is the author of New York Times bestseller, The Gilded Ones, the first book in an epic fantasy trilogy. She has an MFA in film and TV production from USC School of Cinematic Arts and a BA from Spelman College. Originally from Sierra Leone, West Africa, she moved to the US when she was 9 and has been traveling back and forth ever since. She now works as a screenwriter in Los Angeles and loves building fantastical worlds and telling stories with fierce female leads. Her latest book, The Merciless Ones, is the epic, hotly anticipated sequel to The Gilded Ones, a story about a girl with the power to remake her world or destroy it. We are so excited to have you all here tonight to talk about your books. Everyone, please make some noise in the chat for Namina, Kalynn, and Ayanna. Woo, amazing. Thank you all so much for being here. It's such a pleasure to be able to have this panel, so thank you for joining us. I wanted to start by asking you each to kind of give a quick elevator pitch of the first book or just of your series in general, because I bet there's a lot of people will probably know at least one of your books, but not everyone might know all of them. So if we just want to start, if we can start with whoever feels ready.
I vote Ayanna.
Okay. Hello. So I'm the author of the Beasts of Prey trilogy. Beasts of Prey is the story of two Black teens named Kofi and Ekon who come from very different walks of life. Kofi is a beastkeeper at a magical zoo, and Ekon is a warrior in training. One night, their paths cross in an unexpected way, and they end up going together into a magical jungle to try to find a monster called the Shitani, who's been menacing their city for nearly a century. And so they go into this magical jungle, and of course, nothing goes according to plan. Adventure ensues, secrets are revealed, and some of the secrets that are revealed actually have pretty big consequences. And so Beasts of Ruin, book 2 in this trilogy, really is the story of Kofi and Ekon both having to deal with those consequences. And there are more monsters, more magic, and more everything. So Beasts of Ruin came out last week, and then there's one more book, and those are my books.
Oh, why y'all looking at me now?
I nominate Namina.
I'll go. Hi everyone, Namina Forna. The first book in my trilogy is called The Gilded Ones. It's set in a super patriarchal world. where there's a group of women who are considered monsters because they're stronger and faster than regular people and they bleed gold. But then, dun, 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 actual monsters come into the world, and these girls are given a choice, fight or die. My main character, Deka, decides to fight, and in doing so goes on an adventure that changes her life. In book 2, The Merciless Ones, Deka, see, this is the problem with writing like very twisty books, which I did not intend to do, is like you can't really tell people what it is without ruining it. So I'm gonna be very vague here. So in book 2, that's why I still have problems pitching this. In book 2, Deka has seemingly solved the problems that she needed to solve and is now fighting on the behalf of the people she thinks she should be fighting on behalf for, until she's sent on one mission that causes her to question everything. Dun, dun, dun. There it is. The Merciless Ones. I'm very proud of myself.
Yay. Yes, you should be. I'm Kalynn Bayron. I wrote my most recent work is This Wicked Fate, which is the second book in my This Poison Heart series. So This Poison Heart is about a 16-year-old girl named Merciless Green, and she lives in Brooklyn with her 2 moms. They own a plant shop called Breeze, and Merciless has a very unique gift. She was born with the ability to manipulate and control plants. So think Poison Ivy, if Poison Ivy was a 16-year-old queer Black girl from Brooklyn. Merciless inherits an estate left to her by her recently deceased auntie, and she and her moms go up to Rhinebeck, New York to check it out. And there they find a 40 acres of wilderness, a big creepy house to explore, and a walled garden filled with the deadliest plants on the planet. Merciless's goal is to kind of find out about her family's very unique and ancient lineage, which is intertwined with the lives of some very famous gods and goddesses. And all the while, this nefarious group of people is after something that is hidden in that poison garden. Book 2, This Wicked Fate, picks up right where book 1 leaves off. So Merciless is kind of mourning the loss of someone very close to her, and she has to go on a very kind of perilous journey to try and save this person. And so, yeah, that is kind of the duology in a nutshell.
Amazing. Thank you all. Those were excellent elevator pitches. I know it's a lot, especially with such rich fantasy series, to have to distill your book down to, a minute or so, but y'all did great. And thank you for sharing. I wanted to open up with some talk about sequels, because I think it's really wonderful and coincidental that all 3 of you have sequels out around this time. And I think that a sequel presents interesting sort of fun caveats, but also challenges when you're continuing a series. And I was wondering how y'all have been feeling about the process of writing the sequel. Did it head in the direction you thought it would? And B, how does it feel now that they're out in the world for readers to get their hands on?
I'll jump in. So writing a sequel for me was, I didn't know that I was going to need a sequel until I was about 3/4 of the way through writing the first book. I didn't really plan on it. I thought maybe I could fit everything into this one book, and it didn't work out like that. So sometimes that's a nice surprise. The writing, you kind of let the story take you where it needs to go. And so that was a nice kind of surprise, but drafting that sequel then became a challenge, just because there are a lot of moving pieces and you want to keep everything straight, and you want to make sure that you're not kind of retreading things that you went over in the first book, and you still want to keep readers engaged. So So I think my ultimate goal was just to have fun with it and to try to write the most kind of compelling story I could think of. Um, and so the process was really just about, for me, just trying to remember what I wrote in the first book, because I have a tendency to just let it go. Like once it's done and it's out there, it's kind of, I'm on to the next thing. And so had to go back and reread and just make sure that I was staying consistent with plotting the sequel. And now that it's out, I feel like I enjoyed the process for the most part, and the readers are responding, and it's a great feeling to kind of have everything wrapped up. It's a duology. I know that for the trilogy, it's still like we're still waiting for that third book, that third piece of the puzzle. And so I just think I think that's fun. I'm gonna need more than 3 books from the two of y'all. Like I would like to request more. But yeah, it's a fun process.
Well, for me, it was not a fun process. Like, I'm not even gonna lie, like that sequel took a lot out of me. And I think it's because you initially think it's gonna be one thing. And then you realize, oh my gosh, like actually this first draft that I struggled so much on is not one that I'm gonna use. So then you like toss aside most of it and you write the actual story. But that whole process, like for me, is just fraught with like anxiety and insomnia. But then it gets into the hands of readers, and like when it resonates, it's a beautiful feeling. But I'm not gonna lie, for me, sequels are difficult things, and I look forward to not writing it others. I'm like, from now on, standalones. That's what I'm doing. One and done. Bam. Unless it's a middle grade, but like one and done.
Yeah, I think I probably err a little bit more toward Namina in my experience. It was definitely harder writing Beasts of Ruin than Beasts of Prey. For me, the big reason it was harder was time. With Beasts of Prey, there was nobody waiting on me. It took me 5 years from start to finish to write Beasts of Prey, and I got to do it on my own time. And when I needed to take breaks, I got to take breaks. And with Ruin, not only was I trying to promote one book while writing another, I was getting feedback from other people, and I was up against a very real contractual deadline. And that really, to use kind of an antiquated phrase, like that really cramped my style. It really kind of messed up the fun of it, because it felt obligatory instead of just something I was doing for fun. So I had to kind of learn how to work under those kinds of like new conditions and really learn how to block out exterior voices and influences. But it was the piece that was easier was the fact that I had a world established, the fact that I had a map, the fact that I knew my characters at that point and how the magic system works, so I didn't have to recreate the wheel. So that piece was easier. But what made it harder was the time constraint.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that's one of the biggest trials and tribulations of the publishing industry, is the just crunch time. Sometimes it feels like it's always crunch time, even as like a bookseller. It's just like, oh, there's just always so many books out all the time. There's just this constant churning wheel. So props to you all for having made it to the finish line. Here we are, all the sequels are out in the world, and it's beautiful. I think one thing that I want to sort of talk about, because I'm sure readers are interested, I am absolutely interested. So all of your novels are fantasy, but in different ways, certainly. You all build these really incredible sort of systems of magic and also just sort of broader worlds. So I was curious, what is the thing that draws you to fantasy, and how do you approach like world building once you have settled on writing within fantasy? Because there's so rich, there's so much there. How do you begin?
Oh, I'll go first. This is definitely my question. I love fantasy. Like I am a cheap date when it comes. Like you put a dragon in a book or a movie, you put a mermaid. I swear to God, I will give you money. Like I am a cheap date when it. Like I have no standards. Like when I say I love fantasy. That's how much I love it. And like, number one, I resonate towards it because of course, like it removes you from your world and places you into like a fantastical world. There's always going to be like stuff happening that's magic, you know, and you get those, you know, like when you get the chills, like when you're reading something or you're watching a movie, like I love that feeling. So like that's why for me fantasy, but also for me in particular, why I write fantasies, like, well, number one for that, but like why I chose to write fantasy with Gilded Ones is there's the aspect of it just being fantastical, but also the Gilded Ones deals with like real life issues, like, you know, violence against women and oppression and like all these things. And fantasy just makes it easier to relate. Like I'm not gonna lie, I kill off so many different characters in so many different ways in this book. Like, y'all, like if this was a real life, people would have questions about me. Like the FBI would have questions about me. But thankfully it's fantasy, you know what I mean? So like there's the assumption that I am not some weird murderer, you know, just waiting for the moment. So like that's why fantasy is that it does offer you that remove. It allows you to deal with things that you wouldn't be able to deal with, you know, on just like sort of a regular average way. And the second question that you asked was about world building, which is like basically my favorite thing. So for me, all fantastical books exist on a surface that is real. Like I'm sure, Kalynn, you had to do so much research for like just the plants, right? Like what are the names of the plants? What are their properties? What is this? What is that? And that's the thing about world building is that you have to do your research. Like, yes, okay, we're writing fantastical things, but like if I'm writing a fantastical book, I need to have that foundation of research. So for instance, with the Gilded Ones, I wanted to create a fantastical Africa, but I also wanted to create an Africa that was true. Because one of the things is like, I'm an immigrant. I came here when I was 9. And one of the things that I'd noticed in the United States is there's this whole sort of idea of Africa as being, and I'm going to say some words that I hate, backwards, uncivilized, you know, like, which is absolutely not true. And then the worst thing is like, there's this idea that we did not have great kingdoms or great civilizations or great, you know, histories. And so that's why like I chose to create the world of the Gilded Ones in the way that I did, was I wanted to use that foundation that I'd learned. Like, for instance, like I will give you all a fact that I give to everyone because I think it's really cool and like everybody should know this. The largest like sort of man-made project in the pre-mechanical age were actually the walls of Benin in what is now Benin, Nigeria. Like those walls could circle the island of the UK, that's England, Scotland, and Wales, about 16 times. No, wait. Is it 16 times? I think so. It's either Wales or Manhattan, one of them. I get that fact mixed up. But like they were once 4 times the size of the Great Wall of China, or the length of the Great Wall of China. Like this is in West Africa and people don't know that. So that's why in my book, I have the walls of Himyra, which are based on the walls of Benin in what is now Nigeria. So again, fantasy always and world building always rests on what is true. And what your research is. There we go.
Namina basically took my whole answer. I'm just very excited that she mentioned the walls of Benin because we've talked about it before, and I love getting into especially like medieval African history. I think it's really fun. Also, I actually start all of my stories with world building. So I know some people start with character or plot. I start with world, because that's what's most interesting to me in stories is the world. And then I think about what stories fit into that world and then what characters fit into that story. So for me, the world is everything. That's the part that transports readers and lets them, takes them away and lets them kind of escape, which is why I like to read. I read to learn, but also to kind of escape reality for a while. It's just kind of cathartic for me. So I agree with everything Namina said.
Yeah, so I think that for me, I'm drawn to fantasy because I'm a fan of fantasy novels, and I think just any kind of fantastical media in general. I love movies and TV shows and things like that. So I mean, I'm drawn to fantasy because there's just the potential for these kind of magical, fantastical things to happen, and I approach my world building in that way, where I love having a situation where you have this setup that feels like it could be a real place, real people, very nuanced characters, but there's this undercurrent of the fantastical, of the magical, that runs alongside this very grounded setting. And I've been able to do that in both kind of a historical fantasy setting. So for Cinderella is Dead, that's what I did. But with This Poisoned Heart and This Wicked Fate, it's contemporary. It's contemporary fantasy. So there's this really fun element of being able to kind of have these pop culture references and kind of build out this world that feels very new and modern, but there's this undercurrent of magic, of a magic system, of these fantastical events and gods and monsters and all these things, which I just love having those things together. I feel like that's why I write fantasy, because there's just the potential there to have all of these things that I love so much in one spot.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've all spoken to certainly my favorite thing about fantasy, which is this idea that it's both new and fresh and exciting, and also somehow feels familiar. And not necessarily because you've seen the world before or you've seen like the magic before, but there's just something about fantasy that I think lets you get to the heart of an idea even quicker than like realistic fiction does. And I think that's really beautiful. And thank you all for sharing a bit about your world building process. Speaking of, I guess, magic broadly, in all three of your books, destiny or lineage sort of play a role. So my question for you guys is, do you believe in destiny? And do you prefer for your characters or for characters that you read to live up to a destiny or to defy it?
Ooh, I can jump in. So it's an interesting question personally. Like, I don't think I've decided if I believe in destiny, as something that's already laid out, or if we control our destiny. But I'm really interested in fatalism, which is the idea that, when we try to defy our destiny, we end up playing right into its hands. And that's something that in Beasts of Prey and in Beasts of Ruin and in book 3 is a really major theme that Kofi and Akon are going to have to explore and continue to explore. And at least in my books, my answer is, I think that we can shape our destiny. We're not powerless. The decisions we make, good or bad, every day can kind of set us on different paths, and it's never too late to change your destiny too. So I think, at least very personally, as a Black American woman, as a product of a diaspora, it's impossible for me not to think about lineage and destiny, and the fact that ultimately, despite brutality and violence and atrocious treatment, my ancestors survived, they thrived, and did not allow themselves to be broken, and pass on a lot of strength and a lot of love to their children and grandchildren, et cetera. And that's why I'm here, because they took their destiny and didn't let brutality define who they would be or who their children would be. So I think it's very personal. And of course, like, we write the things that are personal to us. So
I think I have like different sort of thoughts on this. Like, do I believe in like destiny and fate as in the woo-woo thing? No. But do I believe that like there's certain paths that people take that end up sort of inexorably like leading you a certain place? Yes, I think I do believe that, but I think that also everybody has like a personal say, and like I can see that path. I know I'm likely to do that, but I can go the other way. But in terms of my books, like I think I'm very much like Ayana in that like I'm really interested in seeing people trying to defy their destiny. But also I'm interested in like people who are not aware that they have a destiny and everybody else's, and everybody's trying to manipulate them, and watching them figure it out and then be like, I'm going to burn everything to the ground, which is the case of like my main character, Deka. It's that, wait a second, I'm caught in this web. This is really messed up. And maybe I want to go towards it, but no, like I want to I'm really interested in like sort of parsing out and unfurling how that happens.
Yeah, I don't know if I personally believe in destiny. I think we all make choices and we walk down certain paths, kind of like Namina was saying. Like there's this element of free will that, you know, we maybe have some part to play there. So I don't think it's all up, you know, I don't think it's all kind of predetermined or anything like that. But I don't know. I'm still thinking about that when it personally. But in my work, you know, destiny and my characters and their lineage, it comes up in almost every story that I write. And I think that's because being a Black person in America, descended from people who were enslaved, it's kind of like there's there is kind of this wall that you run into sometimes when you're trying to find out things about yourself, about your family. And I think it speaks to what was kind of who has access to information and who doesn't. I think it speaks to who has access to their own stories and their own culture and who is denied that. So it's a recurring issue for me because I feel like it's something that I'm still working through. And that usually shows up in the work in some way. So with Briseis, she has very little information about her birth family. And but she has people in her life that are supporting her. And when she wants to know and she wants to ask questions, there's kind of this wall that she runs into. And so for her to kind of press and try to get more information is hard for her. It takes an emotional toll on her when she's just trying to get information that seems like it should be simple. But I think that there's always this recurring theme of where do we come from, who came before us, and who were they, what did they want for us, how does that affect who we are and where we how we see ourselves. And so yeah, it feels like a very kind of personal thing, a personal theme that kind of reoccurs in a lot of my work. But I think that I think it just comes from feeling very connected to people who have come before and wanting to know about them and where they come from and what they went through and how that affects you as a person.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we get to see your characters grappling with these things as well. And in that vein, all three of you have these incredibly powerful female protagonists who are sort of making choices and tough choices and forging their own paths. And I guess my question for you is, do these characters ever sort of surprise you in their power? Like, do you ever, as you're writing them, kind of find that, because I don't know, they're so strong in and of themselves. Have you ever tried to force the character into a corner that they just can't go in, or learn something new where you're just like, oh, I'm trying to make her do this, but she's not gonna, like, it's just not gonna happen. I'm just curious about that, because I know sometimes our characters have minds of their own, you know?
I definitely think like I'm definitely constantly surprised by Dika. I always try to hand her a handicap and then she somehow works her way out of it, like by the end of the book. And I'm like, how did this happen? But also I think like, so in general, when I write, I feel like I'm half plotter, half pantser. In that, like, so I'll write an outline, right? And like for me, and it'll be a very detailed outline, like 8 pages and everything. But in those 8 pages of outlines, when I'm writing, sometimes stuff just surprises you, you know, like you go in and then something occurs to you and you're like, okay, I'll just follow this because it's good, you know? So my main character ends up surprising me all the time. And like the other thing is, your first draft tends to not be your last draft. Like my first draft is always practice. It's like a suggestion. So by the time draft 2 comes around, all that, those well-laid plans that I had would have changed because the characters would now be speaking firmly and demanding their due. And sometimes they move in ways that I did not anticipate. Sometimes I didn't want it, but like, you know, here we are. So definitely.
Yeah, I think that's one of the like one of the best things that happens to me when I'm writing sometimes is the characters just kind of tell me what they're going to do or what they're not going to do. I love when I get to that point in a story in the drafting process where the characters are kind of leading the way versus me trying to force them to do certain things, and any kind of obstacles that get put in their way, they make their way out of. And I find that really fascinating how that process works. I think that Briseis specifically did surprise me often, because this young girl has all of these things stacked against her, but she leans very heavily on her family and her support system. And she, even though these things feel impossible because they're fantastical and they're dealing with these kind of, gods and monsters and things like that, she still finds a way to kind of persevere. And I love that about her. And a lot of the choices that she makes are not necessarily things that I would want her to do. So it feels very much like she's her own kind of person. And she, like, I think about what she would do, what she wouldn't do. And she kind of leads the way there. So I love that part in the process when you kind of get to that point where you know your character so well that they're just kind of telling you how their story needs to go.
So I try to plot out a lot of my story before I write so I don't get stuck. I always leave a little bit of wiggle room because inevitably the same thing happens to me where I want a character to do A, B, and C, and then they do X. And I get totally thrown off. And it's frustrating, but sometimes I think some of my best ideas have come from doing that, from letting my characters really lead. To your point about writing kind of a strong female character, I have several in Beasts of Prey and in Beasts of Ruin, several women who are strong, but one thing I've had to sort of confront personally is like kind of pushing back a little bit against how I define strength, because there was a period of time when women in especially fantasy were the damsels in distress, and then everyone started saying we want strong female leads, and then we did overcorrection where now in order to be strong we had to have girls who knew how to use weapons and who were tomboys and basically completely like unfeminine in any way, because femininity can't be strength. And we know that especially for Black women, that's a stereotype. Black women are supposed to be strong and kind of put the team on their backs and kind of carry everything and not take care of themselves. And that's something that I have grown up seeing in basically every form of media. So I wanted to make sure that in addition to writing female characters in my stories who have agency, that I'm also giving them room to be emotionally vulnerable, to be feminine if they so choose, and to redefine and challenge what it means to be strong. At least I tried. We'll see. Well, I don't know if I landed it, but that's something that I want to do with my stories.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really refreshing to see characters taking that turn and kind of defining what strength means in a new way. It's powerful. Actually, speaking of strength, my next question is a fun one. So your characters, they're in fantasy worlds. They're getting put through the ringer sometimes. There's a lot of peril and such difficulties. So my question for you is, how would they survive if they were sort of pulled out of a fantasy setting and like dropped into, let's say, like a rom-com like set in our world? Like, what kind of trope would they fall into? Like, what would their whole sort of story be?
Ayana, I feel like you got something already.
No, I was just going, oh God, like, ooh. I mean, and I want to acknowledge too, because and not picking at you at all. I find that in YA fantasy too, there's a lot of focus on the women, and there are very few stories with Black.
Nope, we cannot hear you at
Can you
all.
all hear me?
Oh, there you go.
Okay, sorry. For some reason I cut out. Just saying, YA fantasy tends to center girls, which is great, but there's a whole boy, male perspective in my stories. He's a Black boy. There are not a lot of Black boys in YA fantasy, so I never want to forget him. I think it'd be really funny to put them in a rom-com world. Kofi, because she's just like this. Both Kofi and Icon are both very, very.
No,
Did I cut out?
Yeah.
Did it cut out?
Yeah.
Sorry, it like muted itself. I think it'd be really funny because they're both super sheltered kids who have not had much social interaction, especially with the opposite sex. So it would be pretty disastrous to put them in a rom-com, but really entertaining.
I feel like with mine, it would depend on what stage Deke is at, because in the beginning she's like uber religious. So if you put her in a rom-com, she'd think she'd gone to hell and that it was a punishment, or her version of hell, and she'd think that she was being punished and would spend like the whole time crying and begging, trying to get somebody to save her and trying to prove her worth so that she gets the hell out of wherever she is. And if it was later in her development, she'd be like, oh, this is hell and I'm going to kill everybody. Like, oh, kill first and then figure out, because like all this shit, like, all this stuff, everybody looks like weird. Let's just stab and then we'll figure out the truth. So I feel like she would come in swords blazing, and then finally have to be talked down off the ledge. But either way, it wouldn't go well, especially not for like the guy in the situation. Because I feel like the other thing is, like, imagine like how people look now, versus like people from a fantasy world. I think the first thing she'd be like is, are all the people in this world like without houses? Look at their clothes. Like, they're not wearing like much in the way of finery, so they must all be poor. So like, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know. I think that Briseis and Marie would be, I don't know, Marie suffers from this kind of like main character syndrome. Like, she thinks she's just it all the time. So I think she would probably get told about herself like real quick. If this was kind of like it's a contemporary, so we're already kind of halfway there, but like in a rom-com setting, like she's just too busy, like just fighting people and just, like she's just a mess. She's a mess. But Briseis, I think, would be all right. I think Briseis would fall, into that pretty easily. And I think Carter too, as a character, I think he's kind of awkward, and he's like, he works at a bookshop, and he's kind of, a little reserved, but I think he would do well there in that space, as a rom-com too, but not Marie. She's not invited because she doesn't know how to act. So.
Amazing. Thank you for those three incredible answers. I liked being able to ask such a fun question, and thank you for indulging me. And also, I love how different all three of your answers were. I think I want to see the rom-com of all of your characters. So we're getting close to audience Q&A time. So I'm going to ask one more question, and I want to encourage our audience members to submit questions via the Q&A box down below. And I will be able to ask your question to our three incredible authors. But my next question for all of you is, as far as sort of your writing process, get more into like the technical stuff. I feel like everybody works a little bit differently. Everybody makes different sort of discoveries. But would you say, like, do you define your process by like strict sort of organizational research, outlining, and that sort of thing? Or do you sort of go with the flow, embrace the chaos, and kind of see what comes up? Like, how would you describe your overall process? And let's say we can focus on the sequels, since I know process can change from book to book. But
I can go. We talked about this a little bit before we officially started, but I think for every book it's different, because they're just different needs, different characters, different worlds that you're working in. I like to plot. I mean, if I can't, like, there are plotters and pantsers, people who write by the seat of their pants. I can't do that very well, because I get stuck, and then I don't know a way forward, and then I get discouraged and I overthink, and it just like snowballs. So for me, more times than not, I have to have something. Now, sometimes my outlines are like a sentence to describe each chapter, and sometimes my outlines are literally saying, and then they did this, and then they did this, and then they did this. Chapter 2, and then they did this, and then they did this. And it's just me kind of writing it out. I need a plan. And like, this is where when people ask me, like, which character in your books do you relate to? It's Ekon, because like Ekon, I need a plan. And the plan, like, I don't love when plans deviate. It gives me anxiety, but I like to have a starting point and a plan, and then, I can kind of adjust a little bit as we go. But I need a way forward and kind of a path and a goal to achieve. Like, I always say, okay, I know what my word count for a book is going to be before I start. I may not hit that word count. I may go over or under, but I'm shooting for 100,000 for my books. So that's the consistent part. But everything else, like that 15% of wiggle room that I give myself, like that's super chaotic. Like, sometimes I write, sometimes I type, sometimes I use my iPad, sometimes I make a voice recording and talk to myself to get the idea out. Leigh Bardugo is a pretty well-known YA fantasy author at this point. And I remember in one of her interviews, someone asked her how she plotted Six of Crows, which is a heist book. Heists are very difficult. And I remember she said, she was doing everything at one point. She was on the whiteboard, she was writing, and she said, whatever it takes, basically, is her motto. Whatever it takes. And I've adopted that. So for me, it's whatever bizarre thing it takes to get the book done.
I love that that you do a voice note, because I do a voice note too, and it's the most rambling, like, weird, like, I'm interrupting myself. My whole kind of thing that I'm trying to do is just to kind of get a good idea of where I'm going from start to finish. And I, give myself other suggestions. This voice note ends up being like an hour long. It's a mess. But that usually comes after I've had some time to think about an idea for who knows how long. Like it could be a really long time, it could be a shorter period of time, but I've usually had this idea in my head for a while. Then I'll talk it through with a voice note, and then I'll create like a zero draft that is basically just like bullet points of plot points, dialogue, setting, things like that. And then I'll use that to create a kind of like a roadmap for that first draft, which is allowed to be really messy. For me, it includes a lot of notes, a lot of comments to myself in the margins, a lot of brackets where I'm like, a fight scene needs to happen here, so it just says fight scene, and then I move on. That's kind of what the process looks like for me at this point, and that has changed a lot since book one. I wrote Cinderella is Dead just one chapter at a time, as far as I could kind of think, and then I wrote the chapter, and then I move on to the next one. That's no outline. That's kind of how I did it. But now I have all these deadlines, and it's like I got to get things done in a more efficient way. So I'm still refining my process, and I'm always picking up new things and trying new things. And like Ayana said, whatever works, whatever you need to do to get it done.
I mean, in theory, my process is that I have an idea, I write a treatment, which is like a one pager. I let it sit for a year while I do passive research. So that's like reading books, watching documentaries, et cetera, et cetera. And then usually a year to the day, I get the idea again, this time more fully fleshed out. I write an outline, send the outline to my critique partners. Once they say yes, then I start writing pages. That's the theory. In practice, all of that stuff happens, and then I get to writing pages, and I just then choke, and I just like sit there, and I have massive anxiety, and then I doubt, will I ever write again? And then I spin my wheels for forever, and then when like the anxiety gets too much, I actually then start writing, and then I finish. It is chaos. I'm still working on it. One day we'll get there. I don't know, like my process used to be way different. It used to be very, and now it's like just so we're slowly getting there. We're going to get back to where I could say this date and then get back there.
Absolutely. I love the sort of balance that each of you has in a different way of like best laid plans and just utter instead of chaos, let's call it freedom. But yeah, that's really, really amazing. Thank you for sharing. We're going to get to audience questions now. So we have a question from Amy, which asks, with all of you including magical and fantastical elements in your book, do you have any author or book that was influential to you when writing your series?
So I actually like, weird part of my process is because I live here in LA and I went to film school. I tend to use books, and I tend to use movies and TV shows as touchstones. So and this is really funny. Initially, when I was writing The Gilded Ones, my touchstone was 300 and Spartacus Blood and Sand. And then as I started writing it again, it was Attack on Titan. I went back and I watched 300. And I realized that it was one of the most ableist, racist, white supremacist. We were in different times back in the day, but like I instinctively knew it back in the day because I was like, I want to write a movie I want to write a book that has the feeling of that, but is all Black women and like women of color and like different types of women and queer women going up against the patriarchy. But like when I went back and I watched it this time, I was like, wow, we really were watching this being like, this is Sparta. Yeah. So, yeah.
I don't think I have just like one thing. I think it's kind of a collection of things, but I am continuously inspired by the work of Zora Neale Hurston, specifically when we're talking about magic systems that have to do with Black people in the American South, which is where my family is from, Birmingham, Alabama. So it's these stories and this folk magic and this system of beliefs that kind of that she was working through, and she was collecting these stories and researching them, and her work is hugely influential to my work, because I feel like my characters are always kind of trying to find out new things about themselves. So her work is hugely inspirational to me, and also obviously Toni Morrison's work, and how, especially Beloved, because we're talking about family issues, but we also have this fantastical kind of undercurrent, which is what I strive for in my work. So I would say that, like, in the literary world, those are the two biggest influences on me and my work.
I feel like I have learned something from every book and every author I've read, good or bad. So I'm going to narrow it down to YA fantasy, because that's my favorite genre to read, favorite genre to write. And I was, I'm about to turn 30. And so I was a part of that generation and that group of people who, when we were teens, YA was really, really booming. Like I was in high school for the last Harry Potter book. I was in high school when Twilight was big, when The Hunger Games and Maze Runner and Divergent and all these big, big franchise YA books were out and they were being turned into movies. So I say that to say, like, that had a huge influence on my writing, for better or for worse. And in YA fantasy, I remember one of those books, like, I actually define my life by books. Like, I can remember summer of whatever I read this book, and that's like a piece of my life. And I remember when I graduated from college, I read An Ember in the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir. And it was one of those books that, like, I fell asleep with it on my pillow, because I would read till I literally could not read anymore. And then I'd wake up and then want to keep reading. And I remember being like, this is so transportive and fun and brutal and everything that I love in a book, but also I'm never going to be that good. Like, I didn't understand at all how editorial processes worked. I didn't know that Sabaa had spent years writing that book. But I was like, I want to write a book that makes readers feel the way she just made me feel reading that story. And her books, I mean, she's a brilliant writer. So Sabaa was really inspirational. And then Roshni Chokshi is just incredibly poetic. Like, I actually yelled at her the other day because I was like, even your texts, like on the phone, are just annoyingly poetic. Can you not? And she's like, sorry. But she said something interesting. As you all can tell, like, I have a researcher's heart, so I'm always citing people. Like, I feel like I need to, like, credit everything. And she said one time, that writers are painters. We have two colors to work with, black and white, and yet we make colors from it and we paint worlds with it. And I thought that was really a cool way to think about what we do. And also just another annoyingly poetic, like, metaphor. It's like, can you not, Roshni? So she's had a huge influence. I always I want to write viciously like Sabaa and beautifully like Roshni.
Absolutely. Yes. Damn, that's a powerful metaphor for sure. I'm going to be thinking about that for a while. So we are coming up on time. Thank you all so much for answering your questions. Amy is thanking you in the chat. I do like to end on one. It's kind of two questions. I have one question for you, but also, if you don't want to answer it or you can't answer it, I have an escape route question. So my question for you is, what are you working on next? Is there, like, any new progress or new work that's, like, forthcoming that you want to talk about? And if you don't want to answer that, what are you reading right now that you're really loving?
I'm working on book 3 of the Gilded One series, and going at it slowly but surely every day, chipping away.
Yeah, book 3 for me. Book 3 is due really soon. And that's something that I don't think readers understand, is that you see the date that a book is supposed to be published, but it's actually due roughly usually a year before that. So in theory, if I want book 3 to come out next fall, it's due this fall. If I want it to come out next winter, it's due, 2024. So, or 2023. So book 3, although I always have a folders idea, ideas folder. I just switched that. And there was something I was going, I'm reading, this is like a bonus, like I'm reading an adult fantasy called The Mask of Mirrors right now. And it is delightful. It's if you like Locke Lamora, if you like Assassin's Creed, like it's a con story in kind of this pseudo Venetian world. It's just, if you're a world building person, it's just, the world is incredibly rich, incredibly nuanced, really compelling characters. And I've enjoyed it so much. Like for some reason, summertime is my time to read big epic fantasies. So that's what I'm reading.
I have The Vanquishers as my middle grade debut. Comes out in September. It's a vampire story set in San Antonio, so I'm very excited about that. I also have at the beginning of next year, I have my Jekyll and Hyde retelling for the Remixed Classics series. That comes out in March. There's a new pub date for that, so that is March 7th now. And I'm wrapping up my first YA horror novel, tentatively titled Camp Mirror Lake, but there's a new title forthcoming that also comes out next year. So have a lot of things to look forward to.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. You guys have a lot on your plate, but thank you for taking the time to be here with all these books forthcoming and everything. I do want to take a minute to just say thank you to our wonderful audience. We so appreciate you guys showing up, coming, and asking questions, being enthusiastic in the chat. Got so many nice hellos and smiley faces, and it's always just lovely to have you as an audience here. So thank you. If you are interested in supporting our authors or the store, I just dropped a link in the chat where you can buy a copy of any of these 3 authors' wonderful books. So definitely feel free to check those out. And last but certainly not least, thank you to our wonderful authors for joining us this evening. It was a wonderful conversation, and I really appreciated having you here. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.